1881, Odessa. A group of young Jewish students gather for their weekly meeting. They usually meet to read Russian articles and have intellectual discussions, but this meeting has a much more serious tone. They have no other choice. They need to get out of Russia. But they also need to figure out what they will actually do and where they will go. For years, they had lived in relative comfort in Odessa, working and studying side by side with their non-Jewish neighbors, thinking they could assimilate into Russian society. But now everything had changed. Jews in Odessa had been subjected to violent pogroms. Newspapers were using Jews as scapegoats, and longtime non-Jewish friends broke ties with them. It was obvious they needed to leave, but this discussion amongst these young Jews would lead to a very specific answer. Jewish farming communities in the United States. Hello everybody, I am Jared Ross, a GeneaVlogger, and on today's video I will be discussing Am Olam, the Russian Jewish farming movement to the United States. The origins of Am Olam lie in the history of Haskalah, which is also known as the Jewish Enlightenment. I won't get too into the history of Haskalah in this video, although if you'd like to learn the in-depth history, I suggest checking out Sam Arono's videos on the topic. But a big part of Haskalah was taking a path away from traditional religious customs and working towards a more modern way of life. It is from this same background in Haskalah that the early Zionist movement grew, and literally at the same time as Am Olam, with many direct connections between both movements. In the 1870s in Odessa, Haskalah was quite popular, especially amongst the many Jewish university students, some of these students even coming from quite traditional backgrounds. One such student was Schneur Bailey, who would later become known as Sidney Bailey and would also become one of the founding members of Am Olam. Sidney Bailey's story gives an in-depth view of the typical background of many of those who would go to Am Olam and Zionism. Born in 1862 in Odessa, Bailey came from a middle-class Hasidic family. Being the firstborn son, his parents had many expectations for him, and he was sent to Cheder, a school for Jewish children, to learn Torah at just the age of 3. Bailey described the Cheder as crowded, dirty, and full of offensive odors, but the students would be there from morning to night. During this time, Bailey became friendly with an older student named Yeshua and his friend Moshe, who had a reputation of being somewhat rebellious. When another Cheder student saw Bailey with Yeshua and Moshe, that other student told the entire synagogue during an afternoon worship about Bailey's new friends. Bailey was accosted for this by a pair of hot-headed fanatics from the school, who threw him out of synagogue and then drenched him with water from a wash basin. This was likely the beginning of Bailey's path away from traditional beliefs and towards the more free-thinking ways of Haskalah. Bailey wouldn't be the only one from his Cheder who would end up on the path to Haskalah, such as his friend Moshe Freeman, who would become a founding member of Am Olam. Moshe and Yeshua would also stay friends with Bailey for many years, but Bailey kept on the same traditional path. For now. After Bailey's bar mitzvah, his parents sent him to a yeshiva, which had horrendous conditions that caused him to physically suffer from sickness, lice, and all sorts of sores all over his body. In Bailey's memoir, he would say about the experience, "It's a miracle I'm still alive." While at yeshiva, a teacher caught Bailey reading Shalom Al Yisrael, a book written by Eliezer Zweifel in the early 1870s, which argued that early Hasidic thought resembled many of the ideas behind modernist Haskalah, but argued against more recent aspects of Hasidism. This book was considered heretical by the yeshiva, and a meeting was called the next day, where Bailey was questioned in front of all of the boys of the yeshiva so that he could be made an example of. Bailey was angered by this, spat at his inquisitors, and immediately left to go home to Odessa. Bailey cut his payas, changed from his traditional long coat to a short coat, and started wearing a modern style hat. Bailey immediately began studying all sorts of subjects in multiple languages with his friends Yeshua and Moshe, and started to also become friendly with many other adherents to Haskalah, who were known as Moskalim. In 1879, Bailey attended a wedding in Balta for two of his cousins who were both marrying daughters of a rabbi from the area named Davidal Balter. This wedding would end up being an important event for Bailey, as he would end up meeting a lot of lifelong friends who would change his life. Most notably, a lot of the people in attendance of the wedding were Moskalim, because the daughters of Rabbi Davidal Balter were hanging out with others in Moskalim circles. One of these Moskalim was Monia Bakal. Bakal was the son of a teacher and married the daughter of a rabbi, but after the birth of their first son, his marriage was pushed apart by his father-in-law because Bakal was considered a non-believer for scrutinizing scriptural texts. Bailey found out that many of the people he met at his cousin's wedding were coming to Odessa, including Bakal. So Bailey helped some of them find work and places to live, even finding Bakal an apprenticeship with a jeweler. Bakal and a few others started boarding together at the house of Mordecai Voskoblinikov, and soon after, all of these people from the different circles of Moskalim who Bailey had met over the years began to get together at Voskoblinikov's on Shabbat and during festivals. They would read Russian writing and have discussions. This group was mostly young students, men and women, with Sidney Bailey being one of the youngest at only 17 years old, but most of the group not being that much older. The group also hosted a lot of visitors who would come through Odessa and join them for these discussions, introducing them to all sorts of other works, such as the British philosopher John Stuart Mill and the American philosopher John William Draper. Bailey became a licensed teacher at this time and taught at a school called Malenki Yeshivat, where students attended for free. Others in Bailey's circle of friends worked there, with his old friend Moshe being the only one who actually got paid. Moshe also helped get Sidney a position as volunteer auditor of professors at Odessa University, allowing Sidney to learn even more subjects, as well as learning from famous zoologist Eli Mechnikov. Bailey also became acquainted with a teacher at a government-sponsored Jewish school with the main purpose of teaching Jewish children how to work as laborers. The school would fail after only a few years due to discrimination against Jewish craftsmen, but would be extremely important as it gave Bailey and others the initial spark of creating farming communities. But soon after, in March 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated and everything changed. Pogroms broke out all over Russia, leaving Bailey and many other Moskalim in Odessa absolutely stunned. While there had been pogroms in 1871 in Odessa, the group had felt that great progress had been made towards becoming emancipated in Russia in the years since. But these violent pogroms changed everything. Even people they had thought that they could trust had now turned on them. Neighbors, co-workers, friends, and others cutting ties with the Jews who they had known for so long. Bailey and many others in the Moskalim circle met together at Voskoblinikov's house and started to discuss what they were going to do. The idea of communal Jewish farming in the United States quickly became the focus. The idea of farming had already come up before the pogroms, and a few had even previously petitioned to establish a community in Kherson, but that had been denied by the government. But the biggest reason for farming? They wanted to show the world that Jews could be farmers, and by doing so, curb a lot of the anti-Semitism. And the reason for choosing the United States? Well, there were a lot of reasons, actually. Many in this group of friends knew a professor from Odessa who had talked about the joys of farming in the US. There were also a lot of recruitment agents at the time who would travel around Russia and find people to migrate to the US, advertising all the benefits of moving there. Many Moskalim also knew about the Mormons in Utah, and this was actually a big inspiration to the group. And with all of these factors, the United States seemed like a great place to go. They wanted to build their own dream society, which would become a part of the United States. And this idea became the basis for the Am Olam movement. They gave birth to a movement to leave stepmother Russia and go to America, the land of democracy, to be Jewish farmers there, and perhaps even to build our own state, like the Mormon state of Utah. Our state would be built on humanitarian principles, such as already existed there. To get a bit more perspective on the history of the beginnings of Am Olam, I contacted historian Ellen Eisenberg.
Hello, I'm Ellen Eisenberg, and I'm a historian of American Jewry. And my first project in this field, my dissertation project, was on the Jewish agricultural colonies in New Jersey. And I teach at Willamette University, which is in Salem, Oregon, where I've taught for now over 30 years. Jews in that area were situated in what was called the Russian Pale of Settlement in the 19th century, were of course looking westward to their counterparts in Western Europe, who had been achieving over the course of that century, achieving what we call emancipation, which is the process of becoming as individuals citizens of their country. So a citizen of France, a citizen of Germany, and so on and so forth. There was great hope that this too would happen in Russia. And the Haskalah was, it means in Hebrew the Enlightenment. So it embraced kind of Western ideals about Enlightenment thinking meaning focus on rational thought and what could be proven as opposed to religiously based thought. And the idea that moving in that direction would achieve for Jews in Russia much of what it had in Western Europe. Maskilim, who were the people who placed their faith in the Haskalah, and those, by the way, are both Hebrew words, believed that secular education as opposed to traditional religious education, working in what they deemed to be normal professions, so outside of the professions to which Jews had been confined in the past, that this kind of process would normalize, that was the word they used, normalize the Jewish experience, and they would become kind of citizens like everybody else, rather than a separate entity within a larger nation. And that faith that this will happen within Russia is shattered by harsher government policies toward the Jews and pogroms. So those would be anti-Jewish riots. Many people who had been hoping that Russian Jews, like their Western counterparts, would be emancipated start gravitating toward other kinds of philosophies. So some look toward revolutionism. We should have a socialist revolution, right, in Russia, and we'll be part of that. Others just vote with their feet. They say, you know, we need to leave. We don't have a future in Russia. Still others say, in order to be considered equal to other nations, we have to have a nation of our own. Those are the seeds of early Zionism. And so there are all these sort of threads floating around. The Am Olam faction combines several of those threads. So they believe that their future is not in Russia, and they decide that the appropriate place, the place where they have the best chance of normalizing, is the United States. So they set their sights on the United States. They embrace the idea of what they call productivization, so removing Jews from traditional occupations and going back to the land. This is something they share with the early Zionists, and it makes sense in the context of Russia, where the vast majority of people work the land, right? So they're going to become normal by working the land. So farming, and they also, many of them embrace socialist ideology, so that their vision is to establish communal settlements where we work the land together in America.
Bacall absolutely loved the idea of Am Olam and immediately threw in a bunch of his money to help fund the movement. The group decided to call themselves Am Olam, which means eternal people, based on the name from an essay by Peter Smolenskin, also called Am Olam. Word got around town about Am Olam, and especially amongst the other students in Odessa, leading to a fast growth of the group. The group started to print leaflets at the university, which was actually one of the few places that they could be safe from police and government intervention. And then the idea spread like a wildfire throughout other towns, with chapters of Am Olam popping up in Balta, Kiev, Kremenchug, Elizabethgrad, Poltava, and many other towns and cities. In only a few weeks, Am Olam membership numbered in the thousands. Although not all of Bailey's friends liked the idea of America. In Bailey's memoirs, he recounts a conversation he had with his longtime friend Moshel about the founding of Am Olam, where Moshel asked, why did it have to be across the ocean as far as to America and not to Palestine? And Bailey actually credits this exact conversation as the founding of the proto-Zionist movement. Moshe would write about this idea in an 1881 article titled
«Еврейский вопрос и Палестина»,
what translates to the Hebrew question in Palestine. Moshe would become more widely known as Moshe Leib Lilienblum and a prominent figure in the Zionist movement. Their mutual friend from Bailey's Cheder days, Yashua became a well-known publisher and also moved towards the Zionist movement, becoming well known as Yashua Hana Ranitsky. Even some members of Am Olam would later move towards Zionism. One of these members was Jacob Cohen Bernstein, who had been studying at Kiev University, but was kicked out after his brother Lev had been arrested for revolutionary activities. Jacob Cohen Bernstein's expulsion led to him being heavily involved with Am Olam and volunteering a lot of his time to the Brotherhood. But in later years, he would become an important figure of the Zionist movement. The Brotherhood was quick to get things moving, and they knew that they would need funding for this. So they sent 2 delegates to Vienna and Paris to look for philanthropists. These efforts would end up being supported by many, including the Alliance Universelle, the Baron de Hirsch Fund, and the Hebrew Emigrant Aid Society, which I should mention is different than the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS.
The relationship between Russian migrants in general, whether they're going to the US as individual migrants or that they're part of the Am Olam, or even going to Palestine, right? If they're Zionists, there's a big push for pushing Jews out of Russia. And then the question is, where will they go? And the philanthropists, both in Europe and in America, have a mixture of motives. On the one hand, they do feel a kind of tie as co-religionists. It's our obligation to help our fellow Jews, etc., etc. On the other hand, they find East European Jews to be somewhat embarrassing. They tend to be much more traditionally religious. They are just much less westernized and integrated, and they have a terrible fear that if there's an influx into their country, so if all of these Russian Jews come to France, or they come to Germany, or they come to England, or if they come to New York City, that will trigger a backlash, right? It might trigger anti-Semitism, and we might get swept up in that, right? We might become victims of that. So there's kind of a dual motive. On the one hand, they want to help them, and on the other hand, they would like to help them in a way that doesn't lead to a huge concentration landing in their particular place or city. So the folks who, on the European end, there are philanthropists largely under the rubric of a French-based organization called the Alliance Universelle, and they assist immigrants in going elsewhere. So they assist migration to Palestine, part of it that kind of branches off that's led by the Baron de Hirsch, and he assists people in going to Argentina. Once they get to the United States, the people that are most instrumental in helping the colonists are based in New York and to a lesser extent in Philadelphia. And they also are attracted to plans that will spread Jews out over the United States. They fear that concentration in a place like New York will lead to an anti-Semitic backlash. Many of them are also attracted to the idea of diversifying the occupational profile of Jews. They're particularly attracted to farming because there's a long tradition in America, this kind of Jeffersonian ideal that the ideal citizen is the one who works the land, right? So there's this whole combination of motives there. And then in some cases, once the groups are here, they then appeal to these philanthropists who have set up agencies to help immigrants. There are a variety of these agencies. And so Michael Halpern, for example, gets particularly known as someone who's sympathetic to colony experiments. He becomes known in these circles, and people will go to him and appeal to him to help their colony.
Some chapters were very quick to get communities started, with 60 families from Kiev and Elizabethgrad arriving in the US in August 1881 and setting up a community on Sicily Island in Louisiana by December 1881. The first community in Louisiana was well supported by many locals, as well as the governor and other politicians in the state, such as the Senator A.W. Faulkner, who personally rowed the boat with the Russian Jews from New Orleans to their new settlement at Sicily Island, but this support was not enough. Things looked extremely positive at first, with newspaper articles discussing the many successes of the community in Sicily Island. Then a flood in April of 1882 swept through, destroying fields and killing tons of livestock. and this would eventually cause the downfall of the community. Some from Sicily Island would go on to participate in other communities built in South Dakota, Arkansas, and Kansas, but many would move to the cities and give up the idea of farming community altogether. By the end of 1884, Am Olam had set up 24 communities throughout the United States. Although, like Sicily Island, a few had already failed by 1884, but most others wouldn't last much longer. Am Olam members would often come in scattered groups, with many abandoning the idea upon arrival and moving to the cities. Of those who had arrived in the different communities, many would give up and leave farming after just a short amount of time. Bailey's friend from Heder, Moses Freeman, was among those who spent some time farming before deciding to leave for the city. Freeman had been one of the founding members of Am Olam, but after trying his hand at farming for a bit in southern New Jersey, he would eventually move to Philadelphia, where he would become a writer for many Yiddish publications. But another major issue for these communities was that the different members of Am Olam and the different chapters all had a different idea of how to structure the actual community. In the founding Odessa chapter, most believed a socialist community was the ideal setup, where the community would be a collectivist style community and there was no private property. In Kiev and Balta, they didn't care as much about being collectivist, but focused more on just getting a Jewish agricultural community set up. There were also varying amounts of religious belief, with some completely abandoning all religious ties and others still adhering to many Jewish laws. Some Am Olam members weren't that idealistic about the whole thing and really just viewed it as a way to move to America. And as well, a lot of these communities were made up of people who weren't Am Olam members and didn't really share these same ideals. But one of the longer lasting communities of Am Olam was the New Odessa colony in Oregon. The first Jewish settlers of New Odessa began arriving in Oregon in July of 1882, although many had arrived in New York as early as 1881. The colony was set up by the end of the year and named New Odessa because a large amount of the settlers came from the Odessa Am Olam chapter. They adopted a very socialist design for the colony and even had the motto, "United we stand, divided we fall." While the community thrived quite well in the first years, ideological differences between the colonists began to grow and eventually caused the downfall of the community.
The Oregon one, their issues are idealistic. They kind of recruit a non-Jewish guy who had experience in agricultural colonies, because this whole colonization, intentional community thing is not unique to Jews. There are many other groups in America that are setting up these colonies. So they recruit this guy. His name is Frey, William Frey. He kind of gains a group of supporters. Some people refer to them as sort of apostles. They kind of worship the ground he walks on. And then others in the colony really don't like him and resent that he wants them all to be vegetarians. And there are various ideological disputes, and the whole thing kind of breaks up for those reasons. So there are a variety of these kind of different experiments. All of them intend to be agricultural, although some of them not exclusively so. Some of them are quite adamant about this has to be only agriculture. Some of them are more communal. They all live in a big house together, and their intention is to persist in a communal kind of settlement on into the future. Whereas for others, it's a more temporary kind of arrangement until we can get our feet on the ground. In some cases, especially on the Great Plains areas that they're getting land under the Homestead Act, the idea of having a communal settlement doesn't mesh with US policy. In order to make a homestead claim, you have to be an individual family. You can't make a homestead claim as a group. That sort of thwarts the intentions in some of the communities to farm the land collectively.
But of all of the communities stemming from Am Olam, the ones in southern New Jersey are the only colonies which lasted for a long time, and some would even call successful, most specifically the Alliance Colony. The first settlers of the Alliance Colony arrived in May 1882 and found themselves in a wooded area with sandy soil that was difficult to grow crops. Along with the help from their new neighbors in the town next to their land, they cut down the trees, built their houses, and started to cultivate the land. And while they had many difficult years, this community was able to grow and flourish well into the 20th century. And in this group of first arrivals to the Alliance Colony were my third great-grandparents, Jacob and Rebecca Ekoff, and their son, my second great-grandfather, Marcus Ekoff. The Ekoffs had come from Kiev, but I actually don't know if they were Am Olam members. While most settlers were extremely young, often in their 20s, Jacob and Rebecca Ecoff were just under the age of 60, while Marcus, their son, was 22 years old. This has actually left me wondering, was Marcus an Am Olam member in the Kiev chapter? The success and growth of Alliance would lead to dozens of other Jewish agricultural communities throughout southern New Jersey, including Woodbine, which would become known as the first self-governing Jewish community since the fall of Jerusalem, when the town became incorporated in 1903. Alliance itself would expand over the years, creating neighboring areas called Norman Brotmanville, although it was basically one big community. The community also transformed from an agricultural community to a mixed agricultural and industrial community, with multiple factories being opened throughout the years, most notably the Brotmanville factory. Over time, the settlers and their American-born children moved further and further away from farming. Being that Am Olam had been born out of the minds of young intellectuals who'd attended universities and constantly spent time advancing their knowledge, school and learning was a major priority in Alliance. Multiple schools were quickly built, teachers and rabbis would travel through Alliance to give lectures about all sorts of subjects, and the children would also attend local schools in Vineland and Millville. Most of the children of the settlers had little interest in continuing farming, many of whom had grown up learning farming as opposed to their parents who'd only known a life of being students in large cities before farming. So many of the children would leave for the big cities once they became old enough. Most especially because that's where the universities were. By the 1930s, the community was barely hanging on and many families had moved away. The 1940s would see a resurgence of Jewish settlers in the area, many refugees from Europe due to the Shoah, but these families came singularly and not with the intent of creating communities such as the original setup in the 1880s, with many of these new settlers becoming poultry and egg farmers. Sidney Bailey had stayed back in Odessa helping with logistics until 1885 when he came to Alliance and shared a house with his fellow Am Olam founder, Monia Bacall. Bacall died just a few months later in 1886 when he caught an illness from helping look after a neighbor's sick child. Sidney Bailey would live a long life, marrying a girl named Esther who'd been in the colony in South Dakota, but then moved to Alliance after the South Dakota community failed. Sidney Bailey would continue farming until 1951, when his family forced him to sell his last 400 chickens, keeping true to an ideal he had formed almost 70 years prior, to become a farmer in the United States. Bailey would die in 1953 at the age of 91, leaving 4 children, 5 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Many of the descendants of the settlers of the New Jersey communities would go on to become very prominent in a wide variety of professions. Famed photographer Jacob Persky, who took many photographs of FDR. His brother Joseph Persky, who served on the New Jersey Supreme Court. Famous writers and brothers George and Gilbert Seldes. The Bayek brothers, who made Bayek cigars, which would become Philly Blunts. And of course I have to mention my great-grandfather Jack Ecoff, who was born in Alliance and would later work with his cousins at Mills Music Publishing, helping market the music for artists like Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, and many others, and being of such influence that his obituary appeared on the front page of Billboard magazine in 1963. While some of the founders of Am Olam may not have considered it a success, at least in the ideals that they originally had of a socialist farming community, many would call it a success as it did allow a platform for a lot of Russian Jews to come to America and create a base for their descendants to grow. As such, Alliance has stayed very important to the descendants. I started a Facebook group for us just a few years ago, and we now have over 500 people in the group. Alliance descendants have also had multiple reunions throughout the years, dating back to 1932, and going all the way to our most recent one in 2018 with over 600 people in attendance. Now, I attended the 2018 reunion and even made a vlog about it, which you can check out right here. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. I'm Jarrett Ross, GeneaVlogger. Catch you in my next video. Thank you to my patrons and YouTube members.